All right, now this man right here, DJ Jazzy Jeff, we stayed at the Holiday Inn Swiss Cottage, right?
It's like I wanted to feel the degradation of slavery.
Oh, wow!
For Alpha, repeat for Alpha, Windows Zetas teams on all sides.
Copy that.
Everyone remembers the moment, but the moment isn't the story. The real question is why it felt so shocking in the first place. For years, there was a sense of safety attached to one name, a feeling that no matter what was happening in the world, this person would remain steady, smiling, in control, above the mess. It wasn't just fame, it was trust. And trust like that doesn't break suddenly. It builds pressure. The image around Will Smith wasn't accidental. It was carefully maintained across decades. Clean success, public optimism, emotional intelligence, always on display. Even vulnerability was packaged as wisdom, never mess, never unresolved. That kind of perfection comes at a cost most people don't see. Because when you are expected to be the good example for everyone, you lose permission to be confused, to be angry, to be human in real time. Every emotion has to be filtered, every reaction managed, every flaw delayed until it can be explained away cleanly. Over time, that creates a dangerous imbalance. The outside stays calm. The inside absorbs everything. What makes this story uncomfortable isn't that the image cracked. It's how long it held. How many expectations were stacked onto one person without pause. How discipline slowly turned into suppression. How being admired quietly became a trap. This isn't about defending or condemning. It's about understanding how a perfect image is built and what happens when there's no space left inside it. Because when pressure has nowhere to go, it doesn't fade. It finds a moment. And once you look at that moment differently, the story changes completely. For most of his career, Will Smith wasn't just famous, he was reassuring. There's a difference. Fame can be chaotic, unpredictable, even uncomfortable, but his presence felt stable. He represented a version of success that parents approved of, studios trusted, and audiences felt good about supporting. He was the rare figure who seemed to move through Hollywood without accumulating damage. That image didn't come from nowhere. It was built carefully over time through choices that prioritized likability, optimism, and control. From the beginning, his brand was clear: positive energy, humor without cruelty, confidence without menace. Even when he played intense roles, the underlying message stayed the same. This is someone you can root for safely, and the world rewarded that consistency. As his influence grew, so did the expectations attached to him. He wasn't just an actor or entertainer anymore. He became a symbol of balance. Success without scandal, masculinity without threat, ambition without bitterness. In an industry built on extremes, he occupied the center. The problem with occupying the center for too long is that it slowly stops being a position and starts being a responsibility. People didn't just enjoy his work, they relied on the idea of him. He represented proof that you could be famous and still grounded, powerful and still kind, wealthy and still relatable. That kind of projection is flattering at first. Over time, it becomes heavy, because once people decide what you stand for, deviating from it feels like betrayal. Publicly, Will Smith appeared deeply self-aware. He spoke openly about discipline, mindset, and growth. Vulnerability existed in his narrative, but it was always framed as wisdom gained, never confusion unfolding. Struggle was something he had already mastered by the time he talked about it. That framing mattered. It kept the image intact, but it also created a narrow emotional lane. There was very little space for anger that wasn't instructional, for pain that wasn't immediately productive, for doubt that didn't resolve into motivation. Everything had to lead somewhere positive, or it didn't fit. Over years, this kind of emotional discipline stops being a choice and becomes a habit. You don't ask what you're feeling, you ask how it will land. You don't express emotion, you manage it. And when management replaces expression long enough, pressure doesn't disappear. It accumulates quietly. Another layer added to this pressure was visibility beyond entertainment. Will Smith didn't just exist in movies, he existed online, in conversations about self-improvement, relationships, fatherhood, and legacy. He wasn't only expected to perform well, he was expected to model how to live. That expectation is subtle, but it's relentless. It turns private struggles into public contradictions. If you're seen as emotionally intelligent, you're not allowed to lose emotional control. If you're seen as disciplined, you're not allowed to act impulsively. If you're seen as evolved, you're not allowed to regress. The more perfect the image becomes, the less room there is for being human in real time. What's often overlooked is how much effort it takes to maintain that level of consistency across decades, not just professionally, but personally. Every interview reinforces the image. Every public moment is filtered through it. Every reaction is calibrated. And calibration is exhausting. From the outside, this looks like strength. Inside, it can feel like containment. You're not hiding who you are exactly, but you're constantly editing which parts of you are allowed out. Over time, those edited out parts don't disappear. They wait. This is where cracks usually begin, not with scandal, but with silence. The kind of silence where certain emotions no longer have a place to go, where frustration gets reframed as patience, where resentment gets labeled as gratitude, where anger is swallowed because it doesn't align with who you're supposed to be. Another complication came from the narrative of partnership and family. His public life wasn't just his own, it was intertwined with a highly visible, openly discussed marriage. That openness was praised as honesty and progressiveness, but it also meant that deeply personal dynamics became part of the public conversation. When private challenges become public topics, the pressure multiplies. You're no longer just managing your own image. You're managing the meaning others assign to your relationships, your choices, your reactions. Every move becomes symbolic, whether you want it to or not. Over time, this creates a strange imbalance. You're constantly visible, yet increasingly constrained. You're allowed to talk, but only in certain ways. You're allowed to feel, but only certain emotions. You're allowed to be vulnerable, but only once it's been processed into something acceptable. The public rarely notices this phase because everything still looks successful. Movies are released, applause continues, smiles remain. From the outside, nothing appears broken, but internally, the margin for error is shrinking. When someone has built their entire identity around being composed, the cost of losing composure feels catastrophic. Not because of the mistake itself, but because it threatens the foundation of how they are understood. One uncontrolled moment doesn't just look like a mistake, it looks like a contradiction. And contradictions are dangerous when your image is built on consistency. This is why the eventual collapse of a perfect image always feels outsized. The reaction isn't just to what happened, but to what it disrupts. People aren't shocked by the action alone. They're shocked because it doesn't match the story they trusted. But that story didn't account for accumulation. It didn't account for years of emotional labor, restraint, and expectation. It didn't account for how much energy it takes to always be the good example. The truth is, perfection isn't stable. It's brittle. It holds as long as nothing tests it too hard. And when it finally does break, it doesn't break quietly. What matters here is not the moment everyone talks about, but the long stretch before it. The years where everything was handled, contained, and reframed. The years where pressure had no visible outlet. That's where the real story begins. Because once you understand what perfection demands over time, the collapse stops feeling random. It starts feeling like the result of a system that left no room for release. And when release finally comes, it rarely arrives gently. As that pressure continued to build, something subtle but important changed. The image stayed intact, but the effort behind it intensified. What once felt natural now required constant awareness, not just of actions, but of reactions, not just of words, but of tone, posture, timing. Everything had to align with the version of himself people expected to see. This is the stage where perfection becomes maintenance. Maintenance is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It looks like discipline, maturity, self-control, but internally, it creates a constant state of monitoring. You start anticipating how moments will be received before you experience them fully. You don't just live events, you pre-interpret them. At this point, even authenticity becomes curated. You're honest, but selectively. Open, but within boundaries that protect the larger image. You share struggle, but only after it's been reframed as insight. You show emotion, but only the kind that reassures people you're still in control. Over time, this creates emotional lag. Feelings are experienced later, privately, after they've already passed through filters. Anger is postponed, hurt is rationalized, disappointment is minimized. The public version stays calm, while the private version absorbs everything without relief. Another complication emerges here: isolation. Not isolation in the physical sense, but emotional isolation. When people see you as the steady one, they stop checking in the same way. They assume you're fine. They assume you've already processed whatever you're going through. Even concern comes wrapped in confidence that you'll handle it. And when everyone believes you can handle it, you start believing you must. This is especially difficult when your public identity includes emotional intelligence. If you are known for self-awareness, you are not allowed to lose perspective. If you are known for growth, you are not allowed to stall. Any visible struggle risks being framed as hypocrisy rather than humanity. So struggle goes underground. At the same time, personal life doesn't pause just because an image exists. Relationships evolve, tensions surface, roles shift. And when those private dynamics are already under public observation, the pressure compounds. You're not just dealing with the issue itself, you're dealing with how it will be interpreted, quoted, debated. Every personal challenge becomes symbolic. That symbolism is exhausting. It turns ordinary conflict into public meaning. It forces you to manage not just outcomes, but narratives. Even silence becomes a statement. Even patience gets analyzed. What's often missed is how this environment erodes emotional release. There are fewer safe spaces to be unfiltered, fewer moments where reaction doesn't carry consequence. Over time, the gap between what you feel and what you show widens. That gap is dangerous. Because emotions don't disappear when they're managed. They compress, and compression increases volatility. The longer pressure is held without release, the more unpredictable the eventual release becomes. From the outside, nothing looks wrong yet. The image still works. Appearances are polished. Words are thoughtful. The brand remains intact. But internally, regulation is becoming strained. This is where the system starts to fail, not loudly, but structurally. Small irritations carry more weight. Triggers feel sharper. The margin for tolerance narrows. And because the image depends on composure, there is no gradual release valve. There is only control until control slips. What makes this phase so difficult to detect is that it looks like success. It looks like maturity. It looks like resilience. The very traits that are praised are the ones preventing intervention. By the time people begin to sense that something is off, the pressure has already exceeded capacity. And when that happens, the breaking point rarely matches the size of the buildup. It often looks disproportionate, sudden, inexplicable, but it isn't. It's the result of years spent being the stable one, the reasonable one, the composed one. Years spent holding an image together so well that there was nowhere left for the mess to go. This is why the eventual fracture doesn't just damage the image, it shatters the illusion behind it. People aren't only reacting to what happened, they're reacting to the realization that the perfection they trusted required more suppression than they ever imagined. And once that realization sets in, the story can no longer be contained the way it was before, because the pressure that built silently for years has finally become visible. When the pressure finally began leaking into public view, it didn't arrive as clarity. It arrived as confusion. People sensed something was off long before they understood what it was. The reactions felt sharper. The emotions felt closer to the surface. Moments that once would have passed quietly now carried tension. This is the stage where control starts to weaken, not because someone stops caring, but because caring has become too heavy to manage perfectly. At this point, composure requires effort in every direction. You're no longer just holding yourself together, you're holding the idea others have of you together as well. That double burden changes how stress behaves. It doesn't move slowly anymore. It spikes. What's particularly dangerous here is how the public interprets restraint. From the outside, restraint looks like strength. Inside, it can feel like isolation. When you've spent decades being the calm center, admitting you're struggling doesn't feel like honesty. It feels like failure. Not personal failure, but narrative failure. So instead of releasing pressure gradually, it continues to build. Another shift happens around perception of criticism. Earlier in his career, criticism could be contextualized, absorbed, or ignored. Now it lands differently. It feels less like feedback and more like judgment. Less about actions, more about character. That distinction matters because it triggers defense rather than reflection. Defense narrows perspective. When someone feels misunderstood for too long, they stop trying to explain. Explanation feels pointless. Instead, reactions become shorter, sharper, more emotional. The patience that once defined the image starts running thin, not because it's gone, but because it's been overused. At the same time, the public conversation changes tone. Admiration gives way to scrutiny. Neutral moments get reinterpreted through suspicion. The audience begins watching not for reassurance, but for signs. Signs of strain. Signs of collapse, signs that the image isn't as stable as it once seemed. That kind of attention is invasive, even when it's subtle. It creates a heightened state of self-awareness. Every glance, every pause, every reaction is loaded with meaning. When you know millions are projecting onto you, it becomes harder to act naturally. You start anticipating interpretations instead of responding instinctively. This anticipation fuels anxiety. Anxiety fuels reactivity, and reactivity undermines the very composure that held the image together in the first place. Another element intensifying this phase is moral expectation. When someone has been positioned as a role model for decades, mistakes are not treated as mistakes. They're treated as contradictions. The audience doesn't ask, "What happened?" They ask, "How could you?" That framing leaves little room for repair. Instead of being allowed to process publicly, the person is expected to immediately reconcile the moment with the image, to explain it away, to restore balance instantly. But emotional systems don't work on demand. They break under it. This is where the pressure becomes volatile. Internally, frustration builds around the impossibility of the standard. Externally, disappointment builds around the shattering of trust. Neither side feels heard. Both sides feel betrayed. The space for empathy collapses. And when empathy collapses, reactions escalate. What people often fail to recognize is that by this stage, the image is no longer just something being protected. It's something being defended. Defense implies threat. Threat activates instinct. Instinct overrides discipline. That's when moments happen that feel completely out of character, but they aren't out of nowhere. They are the result of years of restraint meeting a situation where restraint finally fails. Not because the person wanted it to fail, but because the system sustaining it had no release valve. The public tends to fixate on the moment where everything breaks. But that moment is rarely the most important one. It's simply the most visible. The real story is in the long stretch before it, where emotional labor went unnoticed and expectations kept rising. By this stage, the image is already fractured internally. The public just hasn't caught up yet. And when they do, the reaction feels extreme because the gap between expectation and reality is so wide. People aren't only responding to what they saw, they're responding to the collapse of the story they believed in. That's why recovery becomes complicated here. You're not just repairing behavior. You're renegotiating identity. The version of you that people trusted no longer fits, but no replacement has been accepted yet. This is the most unstable phase of all. Because once perfection is exposed as unsustainable, nothing can go back to how it was. The illusion is gone, the pressure is visible, and the image that once protected you now becomes something you have to rebuild or let go of entirely. What happens next depends on whether there is space for honesty without expectation. And at this point, that space is very hard to find. When the image finally broke in full public view, the reaction was immediate and unforgiving. Not because the action existed in isolation, but because it collided with decades of expectation. People weren't just reacting to what happened. They were reacting to what they thought could never happen. That's what made it feel so destabilizing. For years, the idea of Will Smith wasn't just tied to success, it was tied to emotional safety. He was someone people believed would always choose restraint, wisdom, and control. When that belief collapsed, it forced a reassessment that went far beyond one incident. What followed wasn't clarity. It was confusion layered on disappointment. Some rushed to condemn, others rushed to defend. But both sides were responding to the same shock, the realization that the perfect image had demanded more suppression than anyone wanted to admit. The moment didn't create the truth, it exposed it. What's important here is understanding why the fallout lingered. Apologies were analyzed, explanations were debated, silence was questioned. Nothing landed cleanly because the story people were trying to return to no longer existed. You can't restore something once you understand how fragile it was. This is where many public figures struggle the most. When an image collapses, the instinct is to fix it, to repair perception, to prove the moment was an exception. But repairing an image built on perfection often fails, because perfection is what caused the damage in the first place. The real work happens elsewhere. It happens in letting go of the role that made you untouchable, in accepting that admiration built on idealization is unstable, in allowing yourself to be seen not as the standard, but as a person who exceeded their capacity for restraint. That transition is painful, and it's rarely linear. The public wants resolution quickly, growth on schedule, redemption that fits neatly into a headline. But emotional repair doesn't work that way, especially when the pressure has been accumulating for decades. Another uncomfortable truth surfaced during this phase. Audiences play a role in building impossible standards. We reward composure. We admire discipline. We celebrate people who never seem to break, and then we're shocked when they do. This doesn't mean responsibility disappears. It means responsibility exists alongside context. Understanding how something breaks does not excuse it, but it does explain why pretending it was random is dishonest. What truly destroyed the perfect image wasn't a single loss of control. It was the belief that control could be maintained indefinitely without cost. It was the idea that being the good one meant never needing release. It was the assumption that emotional discipline could replace emotional processing forever. Once that belief collapsed, the image couldn't survive intact. What remains now is something less polished, but potentially more real. Not a symbol, but a human being navigating consequence, identity, and recalibration in public. That process is slower, quieter, and far less satisfying to watch than a dramatic fall or a clean comeback. But it's the only part that actually matters. If this story made you rethink how perfect images are built and what they demand from the people living inside them, then sit with that for a moment. Because this isn't just about celebrities. It's about how often we confuse strength with suppression and stability with silence. If you value stories that look beneath the headline moment and examine the pressure that built long before it, then stay connected. Share this with someone who understands that breakdowns are rarely sudden and that context doesn't weaken accountability, it deepens it. And if you want more conversations like this, the kind that question the stories we've been comfortable believing, make sure you don't miss what comes next. Because the most revealing truths usually appear after the image is gone.